read something in it, and it's really not what the Scripture is talking about. It has nothing to do with this man being impatient and wanting his inheritance now. It was the father's decision or his agreement as a good father to give his children their inheritance. Now, where we see the difference between the two sons is what they did with it. Here's what this young son does with it. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all together. And so it's probably assets that the father gives his son. It's probably cattle. It's perhaps land. It's perhaps resources, servants. So it's something that had to be liquidated in a form that could be used. Now, I think probably what happened was the younger son probably sold a lot of his stuff to the elder son. I think probably the land went to the elder son. He probably said, I'm going to go into a far country and I'm going to seek my fortune. And so this is just speculation. I don't know that to be a fact, but he gathered it all together. In other words, he got it in a way that he could take it with him. He wanted it to be portable. And so there's a difference here between a person who believes in establishing himself. Another guy says, hey, you never know when you're going to be wiped out. You need to be able to have your cash in a jar and buried in the yard so that you can take it with you when you leave town. Whatever the case may be. You never know when you're going to have to flee the country, and so you need to have liquid assets. So here's the guy that believes in solid assets, and here's a guy that believes in liquid assets. And I have to say to you that the difference is just a difference. The elder son did it this way, the younger son did it this way, and the Scripture doesn't comment about the right or the wrong of the way they did it. So the younger son gathers his things together, and it says he took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. I want to point this out to you because I believe that this is important in the text and that God is making a very, very important point, that Jesus is mentioning this for a reason. That's why I included this. It says, when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Okay, now we see that the time that the young man comes to a place of want is not when he spent all. He spent all his substance, but my friend, his substance wasn't what really gave him his enjoyment. We understand he had friends, he had riotous living, and after he spent his substance, he didn't have any friends anymore. We understand all that to be true. But he was just fine until a famine came. And friend, I have to say to you that there are many individuals that think that it's all about what we have, and if we lose everything, then we're going to be devastated. And that wasn't really the young man's problem. The young man's problem was that he came to a place when he couldn't take care of himself. See, he spent all his living, but he could still work a job, couldn't he? He could still meet his needs. He didn't have his substance. He didn't have his inheritance. It was gone. But he still had something that was meaningful to him. He had the abilities to survive. And here we find what God many times does to individuals that He loves. He brings this young man to a place where he recognizes that even his survival, which he has downgraded his mode of living to, is not possible without God's help. The young man before, he thought, hey, these are my things, these are my possessions, this is what I have, and this is how my ideal for living is. He lost his ideal for living, but you see, he was still living. And he was still okay with that. And so there was a famine that arose in that land. I don't think that was coincidental. I think that was God. And it was God bringing this young man to a place where he would see his need. Friend, be glad when you come to a place when you no longer can take care of yourself. Many times we think that it is our ability that sustains us. It's me. I'm the one that got the job. I was the one that was qualified for it. I'm the one that made this deal and purchased this and got myself in this position. Friend, can I say to you that you didn't do anything without God's help? The young man did not have his substance because of his own ability. He had it because it was given to him. And he did not even have the ability to take care of himself in and of himself because it's obvious God took that ability away from him. So he lost his substance that was given to him, and then he lost what he thought belonged to him, which was his ability to take care of himself. Friend, be glad for the circumstances, the situations in your life that bring you to a place when you recognize without God I can't even survive. I've come to a place in my life when I've recognized I don't have abilities that belong to me. I have abilities that have been entrusted to me, but they're God-given, and if they weren't given to me, I couldn't make it. Friend, I cannot breathe without God's help. Every breath I have is given to me by God, and the same is true for you. And if you think that you can look to your ability or you can look to your possessions for security, you cannot, and it is probable that you'll come to a place when you'll have to recognize that. I can't do anything without God's help. I've been in a lot of situations when I've recognized there's nothing I can do. This is a situation in which I'm helpless and that only God can do something. And friend, that's when God works. It's when God works. Many times you have to be brought to a place where you cannot take care of yourself before you let God do what God does. And that's what God lovingly does with this young man. So here's the story. He went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. It means he became a servant of somebody that was a citizen. And sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And so his standard of living has come down. Before, he wanted to live riotous living. He wanted to go into a far country, and he wanted to live it up. And now he's living it down, just trying to survive. So his standard of living has come down, and it's interesting that it's his circumstances that have changed his standard of living. It's not something in his heart that's changed, it's his circumstances. And so now he's come to a place when he recognizes that just hog slop would be good food. If I could just eat some of the slop, and he couldn't find anybody that would give him any. He says, no man gave unto him, verse 17, when he came to himself. So all of a sudden he realizes things are bad. Now, when he had his inheritance, things were good. When he spent it all, things were acceptable. And when he couldn't get hog slop, he realized, I'm going to starve. You see the change in this individual brought on by his circumstances, which were brought on by God. He comes to a place when he recognizes, I can't do anything. The only thing I can do is be a beggar. I can't have what belongs to me. I can't trust in my ability. I can only beg. And he goes on to say about begging, he says in verse 17, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? He says, I'm going to die. I cannot survive at this rate. He comes to a place when he recognizes he cannot survive. Friend, can I say to you, without God, you can't survive? Oh, you may get through life and you may make it to your deathbed, but friend, you'll stand before Him and you won't be able to stand in His presence without the person of His Son, Jesus Christ. You can't survive without God. You can't make it on your own. Any person that thinks they're a good person, and who is it that Jesus is pointing this out to? Really good people. Really good people. Friend, I think that probably if you want to make an illustration here, that it's the scribes and Pharisees that Jesus is saying are like these two sons. Oh yeah, the one, he looked like a commoner, and the elder son would have been a better illustration of the good son. Let's look at that. He goes on to say here, I will arise and go to my father. Verse 18 will say in him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before thee. God, I recognize my sin is against God and it's against you. Well, he's correct theologically, isn't it? Friend, you don't just sin against a person, you sin against God, because all sin is against the holy nature of God, and that's why your sin's not okay. You can just hurt a person, you can't just make it up to that person. You've offended God with your sin. It's an onslaught against God, it's an assault against Him, and friend, it's not okay. And so he's recognized, he says, and am no more worthy to be called thy son, make me as one of thy hired servants. He says, you know what, beforehand I want to have the portion of my inheritance, I want to be somebody. He says, now I'd just be glad to be a servant of my father's because they're better off. Friend, it is true, is it not, that it's much better to be a servant of the King of Kings than a slave to sin? It sure is. It's much better to be a servant of the King of Kings than a slave to sin. By the way, God doesn't save people to be rulers. He really doesn't. Oh, we're going to reign with Christ in His millennial reign, and we're going to reign with Him in His kingdom. But friend, can I say to you that your calling as a believer in Jesus Christ is to serve? You're not going to be anybody. You're not going to be something big. And this young man realizes that it would just be great to be one of his servants of his father because his father treated his servants really well. And by the way, let me ask you a question. This young man wants to go back and be a servant of the father's. Does the father have anything? He doesn't. It's not even possible to be a servant of the father's. He'd be a servant of his elder brother. He doesn't recognize it, doesn't realize that. But his father doesn't have anything because he gave it away to his sons. And he goes on to say in verse 20, he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto the father, I have sinned against heaven and thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, by the way, whose were the servants? They're the elder son's servants. So he said to his servants, bring forth. But was the elder son, was he respectful to his father?
No.
I think so.
In a way.
In a way. I mean, did he show some due reverence? I mean, the father still could order the servants around, right? It wasn't like, hey, you ain't nobody. Don't be telling my servants what to do. They were the elder son's servants, but the father is still commanding him like they're his own. So this younger son's a good son. He's treating his dad well. His dad still can take a ring, and he still has the authority over the servants to kill the fatted calf, but it's not his. And the elder son's okay with the father handling his stuff. It's a whole different thing when he eats it. We're going to see that. That's really what the difference is. That's what the point is here with the elder son.